That was just an incredibly powerful opening keynote, and I'm so grateful for your strong leadership as our first executive director and for your partnership carrying SRE forward so skillfully. I also want to reiterate thanks both to you and to Gila Benchamal and the whole team for your hard work putting together this convening. While I really wish we could all be together in person, I know the experience will still be meaningful and inspiring. And my profound gratitude to each of you who's participating in this convening virtually for being here, for making your voice heard as part of a growing community, more than 250 strong. As Elana said, I'm co-president of the Schusterman Family Foundation. I lead our U.S. Jewish portfolio, as well as our gender and reproductive equity portfolio, which is focused on promoting women's leadership and gender equality, preventing sexual harassment, and advancing women's reproductive health and rights across the U.S. and beyond. I'm also the SRE Network Founding Advisory Board Chair, as Elana mentioned. The impetus for SRE was driven in large part by the frustration many of us were feeling in 2017 as the Me Too movement began to grow exponentially. Despite the dedicated work of many committed activists, issues of gender equity and sexual harassment have stayed on a low simmer in the Jewish community for far too long. And like many of you, I was simply fed up. Fed up with the shocking gender pay gap for Jewish leaders. In 2017, the first woman on the Forward CEO salary survey was number 29, and she's now out. I was fed up with the men's club and men with the top executive roles and women doing most of the work. Fed up with the stories from my colleagues, from my daughters, from my friends in the Jewish community about the bad behavior that's been allowed to fester. Fortunately, when I raised this idea with Lynn and Stacy Schusterman, two amazing women leaders, they readily agreed it was time to channel being fed up with standing up. And in January 2018, we hosted in our DC office a group of 20 leading professionals who were already working on behalf of gender equality in the Jewish community to join together under a shared banner. And from there, the Safety, Respect, Equity Network was born. 2 years later, together, we've begun to write a different story. SRE has worked in partnership with organizations across the Jewish community to do the difficult but very essential work of advancing women's leadership and addressing harassment and gender discrimination. We brought together professionals across religious, gender, and political boundaries to change the way our community addresses gender equity. Issues that were once spoken about behind closed doors and hushed hallways are now part of our plenaries and our communal discourse. Millions of dollars of new resources have been invested in the field. We should absolutely take this moment to celebrate the progress that has been made. But we still have a very long way to go. As we come together today, our country's at a turning point. This pandemic has created suffering on a global scale. It's exposed and exacerbated societal inequities that have long existed. Women and communities of color are disproportionately impacted. And then at this already difficult moment, tremendous pain and anger have been unleashed in America. Centuries of structural racism and injustice against Black people and other people of color are boiling over. We are far from being the inclusive country we envision, and far from the transformation that is needed to bring justice and peace. Put simply, we may all be in the same storm, but we are riding it out in different boats, and that's our theme today. Each of us here today must commit to ensuring that we do not let gender equity or racial equity get pushed to the wayside. As other priorities arise, and they do and they will, we must be on the front lines of championing, organizing, advocating, and for the funders here, investing in these vital issues. Our diversity is our strength, and we will all benefit when our community is truly safe, inclusive, and equitable for all. We're up against a lot. The road is steep, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because that 20-person group that gathered in our DC office is now a powerful force of 250 plus with us today. I'm optimistic because I see people here representing the true diversity of the Jewish community and the gender spectrum. I'm optimistic because SRE is part of a broader constellation of coalitions fighting to advance women's rights and demand full gender equity in the Jewish community and in our country. At a time when it feels like we have so much work ahead of us, when we have so much to fight for, this network gives me hope. Each one of you gives me hope. And I have no doubt we will prevail. I now have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who's an amazing Jewish educator and an outspoken advocate for gender equity, Dr. Elana Stein Hain. Dr. Stein Hain is a scholar in residence and director of faculty at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She also co-leads the Created Equal research team. Over the past year, I had the privilege of being part of 2 text studies led by Dr. Stein Hain, one at the 2019 SRE Summit and one with the SRE Advisory Board. She really blew me away. We found her teaching so powerful, it helped lay the foundation for an openness to learning, understanding who's in the room, and how to create the kind of connective tissue that we need to make real change. And so we invited her to lead the learning with you today. I hope you gain just as much from her teaching as I have. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elana Stein Hain.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It is just great to be here. And Elana, your opening frame was just beautiful and it was touching. And Lisa, your ability to say that this is a steep mountain ahead of us, and yet you are optimistic. It's optimism. We need so much of it right now. So I want to thank both of you, and I want to thank Gila Benjamal and everyone who made this possible. If we were all together, I would be looking at everyone in the room and noticing who I know and who I don't and kind of getting excited. So I'm looking at your names on the side of my screen and just saying hi to all the people I know. It's great to see all of you. And the people who I don't know, I look forward to seeing each other in person and online, however we end up together. For the last year and a half, I've had a book by my nightstand or on my nightstand by Professor Jill Lepore called These Truths. And what she's trying to do in that book is she is trying to tell a narrative history of America that includes multiple and conflicting narratives. So when she tells us about the narrative of George Washington, the first president of the United States, she also tells us about his slave, Harry Washington, and his life and what that looked like. And I think that what we're doing today and what we're actually doing in this country right now is asking what happens when you put the various strands, the various narratives that our communities, that our countries, that our worlds are made up of. What happens if you let them all speak equally loudly and they actually have to contend with each other? And so to talk about safety, respect, and equity in a moment like this is essential, not just for gender equity, not just for race equity, not just for poverty equity, but for the ability to actually allow different narratives to breathe and to have their voice. And so it's incredible to have so many people on this call dedicated to talking about safety, respect, and equity. And with that, what I'd like to do is offer a little bit of Torah for this moment, which I'd like to say is actually a radical activity. And the reason it's a radical activity is because it's presupposing that the future that we want can actually be in dialogue with the past in a way that can refine and respond to this moment. And I want to recognize how radical that is, because I think if you learn Torah in such a way that it is reified in the past, you're not actually going to create a future that you need. And if you leave Torah behind in Jewish spaces, then you're actually not going to change the Jewish spaces. You're going to change everything that's outside of the Jewish spaces. So to be able to thread this discourse together, I think is really, really significant. What is the Torah for the moment? And so as I see the foundations of our society really coming under challenge, whether it's through COVID, whether it's because of the Me Too movement that started years ago, whether it's because of racial injustice, what's happening here is a huge paradigm shift that essentially is pointing to the foundations of our societies and saying, We have a really deep, adaptive, and abiding challenge here. And thinking about that challenge, the Torah for the moment that has come to me over and over again is actually the book of Jeremiah, the book of Yirmiyahu. The reason being that Yirmiyahu, even before we place him in his historical context, he's a person who tells people things they don't want to hear. He says to them, you need to understand that the foundations upon which your society is built, they're actually flawed. And in order to redeem yourselves, it is not enough to pray away the problems. It is not enough to recite some lip service that's going to give some sense that you know that there's something wrong, but you're not going to do the work to fix it. But you actually really have to engage and sometimes even bend before and submit to the problems and be able to say, wow, this is too much, overwhelming, and yet I'm going to find a way through it. And so there's this incredibly poignant moment where Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, if we put him in his context, the way that the Bible talks about him is he's on essentially the last legs of the first temple. He is telling the people, you don't understand. You keep thinking your temple can't be destroyed because it's so beautiful, because it's so impressive, because you have so many buildings, because you have so many people who are engaged, but you don't understand the way you treat the orphan, the way you treat the widow, the way that you do not keep to your covenant of the way this society is supposed to be is actually going to be your ruin. It's going to be your downfall. And he says this, and the people want to kill him. They don't want to work with him. They want to negate the realities, the truths, the narratives that he is bringing up. And in an incredibly, incredibly poignant chapter, he goes head to head with a person who the Bible describes as a false prophet. And imagine the scene. Yirmiyahu is walking around with a yoke on his neck and on his shoulders, a wooden, massive yoke that essentially is supposed to be a symbol of the yoke of everything that the Israelites have to accept that is wrong with their society. And as a result, they're going to have to submit to whatever happens next. And he's standing there with the yoke, he's hunched over, he's burdened. And next to him is this liberated, standing tall, very confident prophet who says, what do you mean? Everything's fine. In 2 years, everything will go back to normal. Everything's fine. Just pray, we'll be fine. And he breaks Jeremiah's yoke and says, look, you're free. Don't feel so burdened. And as I was learning this with Esther Kostanowitz, the writer who's actually on this call, because I did look around the room, Esther pointed out to me, she said, well, wait a second. The word used for yoke for Jeremiah is motah, mem, vav, tet, hey. That word motah, yoke, sounds a lot like mateh, staff, like the staff that Moses carried in order to split the sea or create the plagues. What's the relationship between those two? And Esther's question really framed this entire moment for me. Because I think that in leadership, there are times when we feel like we are carrying the mateh. We are carrying the staff. We can split the sea. We're going to do something dramatic that's going to obviously clear the way. Everyone's going to feel the sea change. But most of the time, leadership is about a motah. Leadership is actually about carrying the yoke and carrying the burden and saying most of the work is not the exciting, here, we just did this incredibly adaptive change that's clearly obvious to everyone, but actually most of the work is the leadership who decides that they're going to hold this on their shoulders and on their backs and walk with it and adapt and work on that adaptation and try to convince others to carry that yoke as well. And that to me is what this group is doing. Now, one thing that's different about a mateh moment where you clear the path and you split the sea, and a motah, it's not a moment, a motah, a yoke process, is that in the yoke process, in the process of carrying the burden, leaders will disagree with each other in very deep ways, trying to figure out how to work through this yoke that is upon us of gender inequity, how to figure out how to adaptively change the field. It's not a splitting of the sea. It's something that we're going to have to carry together. And so I want to spend just a few minutes, if you can access on your WOVA app, which I've been calling WOVA all week. I don't know if anybody else has that experience. If you can access the document section, I just want to look at one brief rabbinic statement that I think captures some of the conflict that is healthy and important in trying to carry the burden, as different from making mass pronouncements that are going to fix things in immediate ways. What we're looking at together is we're looking at what I think is an incredibly subversive text. It appears in the book known as Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Ancestors, which is a tricky book. It's tricky because it makes it seem like it's just sort of pie in the sky happy, this is the way to be a good person. But when you actually understand the context in which certain things are said in that book, you start to see something that is a little bit more of a social critique. And we're looking at chapter 2 in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Ancestors, Mishnah or section 8. It's describing the 5 students that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had. And each one of these students, he mentions what it is that characterizes them as a learner. And it seems innocuous enough, but I don't think it's innocuous. The Mishnah states, our master Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples, and they were Rabbi Eliezer, son of Hyrcanus, Rabbi Joshua, son of Hananiah, Rabbi Yossi the priest, Rabbi Shimon, son of Netanel, and Rabbi Elazar, son of Arach. And he used to list their outstanding virtues. Now, I'm going to list virtue by virtue. As we're listing the virtues, let's actually try to think about what they mean and what they refer to. Rabbi Eliezer, son of Hyrcanus, he describes, also known as Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, is a plastered cistern which does not lose a drop. Makes him sound like the type of person whose notes you want to borrow for the test. A person who holds on to every piece of information. A person who can preserve, a person who can conserve. The next student, Rabbi Joshua, son of Hananiah. Praiseworthy is the woman who gave birth to him. We don't know exactly what this means, but presumably what we're talking about is something that's been inculcated in Rabbi Joshua since his youth. There's something about him that, from the way he was brought up, impacts the way he learns Torah and the way he teaches it. Rabbi Yossi the priest is pious. He's a chassid. Now, usually when we see this terminology of piety, we're not talking about what we see today as chassidim or ultra-Orthodox, and we're not talking about people who necessarily sing, but we are talking about people who go above and beyond the letter of the law. A person who says, this is what I'm supposed to do, I'm going to do more. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Netanel, the one who fears sin. Imagine the person who is constantly checking their boundaries, constantly trying to figure out, wait a second, am I overstepping? Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't do this or do that. Maybe it's too far. And lastly, Rabbi Elazar, son of Arach, who is like a spring that ever gathers force. Now imagine, the very first student there was described as a cistern that holds every drop of water. And the last student is described not as something that holds water, but actually shoots water out. Someone who is so creative, someone who can take what they have and turn it into something new and burst forward with creativity and with ideas. When you look at this 5, this just actually looks like a teacher who knows their students. And would that we all knew our students, our families, our friends, our loved ones in this kind of way, to be able to really understand what makes them tick. But I have to tell you that the context for this is actually a context of transition. It's a context where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he doesn't just have 5 students in a random classroom somewhere. He is actually trying to lay the groundwork for what life is going to look like after the fall of the temple. Because the fall of the second temple is where he locates himself contextually. And so when he looks at these 5 students, what he is trying to figure out is, how are they going to carry this system forward? And what he sees in them are very different character traits and perhaps very different strengths. If I can extrapolate for a moment, there are those of us in this transitional moment of gender equity, of working, I love the way Lisa put it, working to have our plenary discussions about things that couldn't even be brought up a few years ago, even behind closed doors, that actually we all carry this differently. There are those of us who are the cistern that don't lose a drop, who are more the preservationists, who actually are worried about going too far and changing too much in the direction of radical reimagining. We actually just want to try to preserve what's here in a more ethical way. There are those of us whose strengths are like Rabbi Joshua, that actually people like us. We are connectors. We are the people who everyone wants to talk to, and some people look at us and say, well, that's wishy-washy. But actually we can talk to both sides because everyone looks at us and says, well, that person, that's a person, God bless that person's mother, that's a person who I can talk to. There are those of us who are the Hasidim and the Hasidot, who are the pious ones who say, it's not enough to just do this much. We have to go further. We have to push more. There are those of us who are the Yirei Chet. There are those of us who worry about pushing too hard and crossing too many boundaries and losing credibility. And lastly, there are those of us who are like Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach, who are the spring that think, let's be creative, let's create something new. We can do this. You don't have to preserve everything, and it doesn't have to be this kind of between continuity and rupture. We can do all of this. We can bring this entire stream and we can create something new. And you know, for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's trying to live in a moment of both rupture and continuity after the fall of the Second Temple, on the one hand, these people all complement each other, but on the other hand, they're going to disagree on some big things. Imagine the cistern and the great wellspring trying to come to a policy decision about something together. The one pushing for being conservative, the other pushing for creativity and pushing forward. Imagine the person who's the Hasid, who wants to burst forth, and the person who's the Yirei Chet, the person who's worried about transgressing boundaries. All of us on this call, and there are so many other ways that we can characterize ourselves, we all come to carry this yoke with our own character, with our own position, with our own ideologies, and with our own experience. And sometimes those things are going to contradict one another. I want to end with how this Mishnah ends. The Mishnah ends, Rabbi Yochanan used to say, if all the sages of Israel were on one side of the scale, and Rabbi Eliezer, son of Hyrcanus, who was that cistern, who doesn't lose a drop, the conservationist, the guy who can bring the past and keep it on his back, if he was on the other side by himself, he would outweigh everyone. In other words, in this transitional moment, what do we need? We need people who know how to keep the structures intact, who know how to make the change while keeping the structure intact. And then the very next line in the Mishnah, Abba Shaul said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. If all the sages were on one side of the balance, and even the cistern, even Rabbi Eliezer, son of Hyrcanus, was with them, but Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, the guy who's the springing forward, was on the other side, he would outweigh them all. We don't need conservation now. We don't need to keep the structures. We need to burst forth, and that's what we need to do. I love that this Mishnah ends with both, because what it's trying to tell you is that there's no right answer. There are right answers. And what's going to happen in the seriousness, the moral seriousness of the conversations that we have today and tomorrow is some of these fissures that actually prevent this from being a splitting of the sea moment, but actually really emphasize how this is a moment of carrying the burden together. Some of these fissures are going to be so clear and so obvious. And at some point, on some things, we're going to have to come to some convention that we all agree on, and some of us are going to be unhappy. On other points, we'll be able to independently do what we need to do to apply this in our communities and in our leadership positions. But this is a feature. It's not a bug. It's a feature of actually bringing many people on to do the work of change that actually requires many people. So I just want to wish us so much success in the work that we do today and in the ongoing work that all of us are doing between this call and tomorrow's call and so far after into the future, and that we actually should appreciate the dissenting voices that we bring to each other, not because we have to change our own, but because it is essential that we have dissenting voices within a coalition that is going to be broad, that is going to be willing, and that is going to be authentic. I hope it's a very, very meaningful 2 days.